So, a recently published article in the journal World Affairs entitled "A Difficult Start for the UK Labour Government, but Time is Still on Their Side" has argued how the first 10 months of the Labour government in the UK have been quite disappointing, to say the least. These problems go to the heart of what it is to be a Labour government, as we may conceptualise what a Labour government is, or rather, what a Labour government should be. As this short article argues, Labour has not been acting as a traditional left-wing Labour government should. In fact, some of its policies have looked quite unlike those we tend to associate with a party for the working class. We've seen disappointing policies on national insurance contributions, the two-child benefit cap, and stagnated levels of child poverty, and U-turns on things such as the winter fuel allowance and some outright anti-welfare rhetoric. When we think back to the disastrous soundbites around the removal of driving licences for those found involved with benefit fraud. However, this article that we're here to discuss today argues that there is still hope. As one of the article's authors, I aim to take a bit of a back seat today in this discussion, and instead I'm joined by two of my brilliant co-author colleagues to unpack the article's key arguments. From the urgent need for welfare reform and the case for universal basic income to how automation and AI are reshaping our economy, society, both politically, socially, and philosophically. We'll explore what Labour can do to seize this once in a generation opportunity to build a fairer, more resilient welfare state. So, having said that, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, who are you and what is your role in this article and what is your role at work?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Herwin Gwilym, lecturer in social policy at Bangor University. And my role in the article was I was the lead author of the article, and I kind of arranged for the article to be co-written by these great colleagues of mine.
And I'm Dr. David Ellis. I'm a senior lecturer of philosophy, ethics and religion at Leeds Trinity University. And in this paper, I was looking at artificial intelligence and how it's going to impact society going forward.
And I'm Dave Beck, and I'm a lecturer in social policy at the University of Salford. And my work is on food insecurity and basic income. And for this article, we were also joined by Dr. Ed Jones as well from Bangor University, and Dr. Sarah Kloss-Davis from Manchester University as well, who are not with us today. Okay, so the first question that I'm interested in is about the article's content. So the article advocates for a shift from means testing to universalism. What do you see as the biggest barrier to implementing this shift in the UK? I think that's more of a question for Herwin.
Yeah, well, as you know, Dave, the welfare state, as we know it, more or less, has its roots in post-Second World War, 1940s, and the Beveridge report. And most social security benefits in that report, and subsequently when the welfare state was established, were universal benefits. And so over the decades, we've seen decrease in universalism. And at the same time, we've seen an increase in poverty and means tested benefits, and of course then the period of austerity. So the main point there is that a return to universalism is likely to have a positive effect on poverty reduction, because it will make benefits available for more people. It'll be easier to apply for those benefits, getting rid of some of the complexities, and it would make it easier then for people to to feel more secure and be in a better position to actually find work, and without losing out by going back into work if they've been away from work for a period of time.
Yeah, definitely know that there is this trap that appears in the current benefit system where people tend to be trapped in making this decision between when it's time to leave work, can they afford to leave work or not? Yeah, thanks for that. So you also, in the article, it also mentions automation and AI as drivers of inequality. How do you envision balancing this technological progress, philosophically across society with, social equity?
Yes. So I think without doubt, artificial intelligence is and will continue to have huge impacts on our society, our culture, our politics, and also our workforce and economics. And I think there's lots of pros and cons, and it's a complicated situation, I suppose, for the government. On the one hand, there is a desire for the United Kingdom to become a leader in artificial intelligence, to be a place where companies set up and progress in these fields. And with that, though, comes a concern that if there is too much regulation, if there's too much constraints, this might actually put off investment, and it might put off the developments and advancements in that respect. But then on the other hand, without any suitable regulation, be it just the ethical constraints of it, but also a broader awareness of how the implementation of AI in the workforce is going to have huge impacts. Even one of the things was suggested is about workforce displacement, about people losing their jobs to automation. And it might not just be the odd one or two people, it could be whole industries nearly. So to have a far long-term awareness of these ethical implications, I think are really needed. And I suppose my worry when researching for this article, in fact, was how much I found in government documents tucked away here, there, and everywhere. But you wouldn't think that it's there when you think about their actual policies and behaviour sometimes. So yes, it's a complicated picture. There's huge ethical considerations, and I think there is almost part of it is of trying to fight the tide. I think artificial intelligence is coming into the workplace in various sectors. It is going to happen, and we need to quickly adjust to work with it rather than have it take away our work, right? So I think we definitely got to make that compromise.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but I think it's a South Yorkshire MP his new constituency office is now being run by AI. He doesn't need to always be there, and his constituents can ask his AI chatbot questions about policy, about problems in his constituency. Okay, so the commentary article that we did write, it proposes this idea of a universal basic income. So what evidence most convinced you that UBI is the most viable solution?
I think I got into the article because of the difficulties the current Labour government is experiencing, and particularly during its first budget in the autumn 2024, it introduced increased the employers' tax contribution and some other controversial things such as inheritance tax on family farms. Plus, of course, the winter fuel allowance, which was going to be taken away from pensioners, and there's been a partial U-turn on that. So, but as these policies were introduced, the popularity of the Labour government became less and less, and that started me to think about, okay, how should they approach welfare reform? So they raised some questions about how do we address welfare reform, because there's a lot of public support for good public services. One of the reasons why Labour did have such a good election win in 2024 was people's fears about the National Health Service and the waiting list. And there is general support for more spending on health service, more taxation to make that possible. So in looking at welfare reform, and particularly the way that we've seen poverty increase considerably in the last years, even amongst pensioners, even though the pensioners have a triple lock, there's still 1.7 million pensioners in poverty in the UK, and there's about 14 million plus people overall in poverty in the UK, over 20% of the population, which is a huge amount of people experiencing poverty. The interest in universal basic income increased, and we've looked at this before in other areas, such as in Wales. There's a pilot happening in Wales, which is not going to be extended beyond this year. And the idea of introducing universal basic income is increasingly popular, partly as well as a result of the COVID pandemic. And then, of course, we've gone into the cost of living crisis. So what we say in the article is that this is a kind of a valuable goal to achieve, but to achieve it is very difficult. there's a lot of questions people are asking, a lot of persuading to be done, and we argue that we can move towards universal basic income gradually, by addressing some groups first in having a basic income and then extending that as time and finances allow. I mean, the obvious groups would be people who are more vulnerable, such as older people, young people as well. We need to have more, wealth generational distribution in the UK, and those groups, single parents as well, perhaps. So those groups are the ones who are kind of would be the obvious people to start with a basic income and then build it up more to become a universal basic income. But that would be like a gradual process, I think.
Got maybe quite a critical question for Dave. Thinking about the problem I usually come up against with when I advocate for basic income is I see it from my position. It's quite a socialist position. Everybody gets a pocket of money to be able to compete in the world and to be able to feel equal. So from quite a socialist perspective, a universal basic income works. However, when I talk about basic income and my desire and love for the basic income, I usually get called a neoliberal because it would give people money that they would have to spend, and it continues the capitalist system. I'm wondering, have you got any ideas on how we can square that circle about basic income maintaining capitalism?
So that's a very good question. I'm not sure, because I feel that yes, if we are provided with an income which we're going to spend, that's not actually going to change the system in which we are spending it. So the capitalist system will still remain. And I could imagine capitalist systems are pretty adaptive at changing and finding new ways to, maintain you as a consumer and maintain you your expenditure. One of the reasons why I got so interested in this paper was when looking at the AI and its power to change how our economies are ran, how our businesses and companies are ran, was a realization that it's going to affect so many people, and it's going to affect many who are perhaps capitalistic inclined. So when you're speaking about the socialist attitudes, and we're thinking about labor, we're thinking perhaps about unions, we're thinking about labor jobs. AI is going to be predominantly impacting not manual labor jobs. It's going to be affecting secretary work, management, economics. It's going to be impacting industries and areas which are not traditionally associated perhaps with the literal meaning of labor. So for example, I found, again tucked away in a Department of Education document, that the jobs they think that are at the most impact of AI automation are those with clerical work, finance, law, business analysts, management consultants, accountants, even psychologists. However, those occupations least exposed are sport professionals, roofers, and steel erectors. So it makes us start to realize that the jobs AI are coming for isn't going to be necessarily your steel factory, right? It's coming for perhaps jobs and industries associated more with the middle class. And I think this is going to perhaps change. I know, in a capitalistic way, they're coming for your jobs, not their jobs anymore. And that might start to change opinions and start to change minds. I'm thinking with AI, we had an industrial revolution. I'm thinking here of an AI revolution, right? But it's a different sort of job sector that's going to be impacted here. And it may well, when you was mentioning then about having an AI do the job of the politician, cynically put, some politicians are like robots, right? I can well imagine finding more civil service workers having AI creep into their workplace and gradually begin to make some of them potentially redundant. So yeah, when it comes to how can we square this circle between, that sounds very socialist, but are you not just adding more money to the fuel to the fire of capitalism? I think so, but at the same time, I'm really unsure what AI is going to do. I think it's going to depend how we work with it. Are we going to use AI to improve our own outputs or to replace us as workers? Then we're going to have mass social change. So perhaps in a turnabout way, if AI was to start to make mass changes, maybe that would be the environment to start rethinking how the capitalist system actually works. But yeah, that might not be too optimistic.
Yeah, I would add to that as well, Dave. That UBI would not necessarily change capitalism. It's kind of an interesting question, but I think it would potentially eradicate poverty. Or at least most of the poverty that we see currently as a result of kind of inadequate benefits, for example. So I think it's a good chance it would eradicate poverty, but not change capitalism as the predominant system. And I'm not sure if UBI is actually there to replace capitalism or not. It's not necessarily that's its purpose. And I would also add that the reasons why obviously people think or criticize you for being a neoliberal when you're supporting UBI is because so many neoliberals actually like UBI. We know about Elon Musk's support for a higher basic income, not just a universal basic income. Bill Gates and others, and that's been criticized for, or they've been criticized for getting off the hook, as it were, particularly in terms of workers' rights, and decent pay, decent working conditions, decent pay. Some of these organizations are paying their workers really poor quality salaries in Amazon warehouses and other places. And so if a UBI came in, that would rescue them from their responsibilities to provide good and decent pay and good conditions to their workforce. And that's probably the reason why they are in support of UBI, because it lets them off the hook. And that's my kind of concern about UBI, and it's concern of quite a few skeptics about UBI, that it actually doesn't change that kind of relationship between employer and employee. So that's a kind of concern from my point of view.
Okay, thinking about that relationship then, how do you think the public would respond to proposed tax reforms, especially those targeting, as we put in the article, this basic income should be paid for by wealth taxes on money generated from AI. How do you think the public would respond to that?
Well, I think there's some tax reforms that the public probably welcomes. For example, one of the arguments in the article is that the higher rate of taxation, for example, on income is starts around £50,000. There's a strong case to be made that that's too low. There's a lot of ordinary people earning £50,000, teachers, for example, nurses, maybe some of them on the managerial level. So it's possible to raise that to, we argue in the article, to around £70,000, but raise the tax rate from 40 to 45%, and maybe potentially even higher, and tackling wealth as well through wealth taxations. And we also argue for fuel duty to rise, because it hasn't risen since 2011. Petrol's gone up because of inflation, not because of fuel duty. But it's only gone up about, far less than, for example, gas and electricity, which have gone up massively under the cost of living crisis. So there's some certain tax reforms, I think, that could be sold to the general public, despite the fact that we have the highest tax burden ever, I think, and the huge spending that the state embarked on during COVID and the cost of living crisis, which was massive. But there's still support for good public services, particularly the National Health Service, and people are prepared to pay higher taxes, I think, and fairer taxes, because the tax burden at the moment is not fair. They would be prepared to pay more taxes, but they want a fair tax system so that people who are generally wealthy are paying more, rather than the people who actually are paying taxes as income tax are paying more overall than very wealthy people. So I think there is kind of an appetite for fair taxation, and I think that could be delivered. I think there would be public support for it.
Yeah, I think there could be public support to coming in from the AI angle if the public were perhaps more aware of how perhaps the word devastating the workforce displacement could be through the full implementation of AI. I mean, the public idea, we hear of AI and people think, are concerned about it, but to put it into stronger terms, I found a study from 2024 which shown that if AI was used to augment workforce, so augmentation is when you use artificial intelligence to improve the workers' outputs or the actual work stream without anyone losing their jobs versus displacement. If there was a full augmentation, there can be, in this study, 0 jobs would be displaced, and it could in fact provide a boost to the economy of 13% of the GDP. But on the other extreme, if people were just replaced by AI, there could well be 8 million jobs that would be lost and there'll be no GDP gains. And in a situation like that, the demand on an already stretched welfare state would become so greatly increased. Even if somewhere between those two scenarios, it was calculated there'd be 4.4 million jobs would disappear, but still no significant economic gains of about 64% of GDP. So with the idea of the taxation, it's more of to encourage businesses that are inclined to use AI to do so in a way where workers have their work augmented rather than their jobs replaced with these digital machines. So I think taxing them in that way could sort of nudge them in the right direction, or be punitive if necessary. If a whole 200 people lost their jobs at some company because they're just going to use ChatGPT or something like this, right? So I think taxation could be used in that way, and I think when the public hears it in those terms, I think maybe there'd be more of a sympathy to it. That they could get what the government's trying to achieve.
I would add as well that in the article we do cost our recommendations, so we do explain how a new BI could be made affordable, and we explain how that could be done. We roughly say that a new BI would cost somewhere around £70 billion a year, which is roughly about 2% of GDP. So that's clearly affordable, particularly if it's introduced gradually. A lot of people are misunderstanding about how much UBI would cost and think it's far more expensive than it actually would be. So it could be done and it could be paid for. We explain, we have a section on costings to explain how the tax system could be reformed to make it possible through higher taxation on wealth, taxation on people who gain from automation that leads to unemployment, field duty, and we also explain how we can balance the regressive nature of some of those taxes by other taxes, such as on aviation fuel, etc. So I think that's kind of a good strength in our article, is that we don't dismiss the costings issue and how it's going to be paid for.
Also, it's not mentioned in the article, but can you just, Kevin, perhaps give a little background to other means of being able to pay for basic income, such as, as other things that other work you've been involved in on prisons and rehabilitation?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because one of the things I was developing recently is not mentioned in the article, but the link between potential links anyway between UBI and recidivism, in other words, reoffending in terms of crime. And the evidence I found says, there is evidence, there is research being done in different parts of the world to show that a basic income has reduced offending. And so, those kind of things would be huge savings for society, huge costs of keeping people in prison, etc. So you can keep people out of prison and stop them committing crimes. Then, if that can be done through the UBI, then the state, the country saves a lot of money. And likewise, if people are healthier, and there's evidence from the pilots, as you know, of UBI, that people's mental health improves, their sense of well-being improves, they become more entrepreneurial, they invest in themselves, they go into training, into education, open up small businesses, etc. That's obviously a huge saving to society because they're healthier. It's going to mean less illnesses, less cost for the National Health Service, and eventually, potentially, they'll be less dependent on the state for things such as social security and universal credit. And we've seen, the huge failure in universal credit in the UK. It's just left people actually in poverty. Most people on universal credit are working. Most of those are women. So, it's like a huge problem in terms of work poverty, which affects so many people. Many of them on universal credit and finding it difficult to come off universal credit. So they're kind of stuck in that kind of poverty loop.
So what lessons can we learn from other countries, like the Nordic welfare model? And what challenges might arise in applying them in the UK?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the Nordic societies are so different to the UK. Their history, their welfare systems, their values, and that's what makes it difficult to kind of replicate somewhere like Finland or Denmark or somewhere. They've got longer traditions than we have of social democracy, of unions and businesses, the state and civil society working together. We just lost those kind of values since the 1970s in the UK. So it's extremely difficult for us to kind of replicate it. We might learn from it, but it's difficult to put that into our system, which is very much a liberal, neoliberal welfare system. Such as we're closer to the US in that respect than we are to the Nordic societies. But the Nordics have done a few things which I guess we could learn from, that we could actually implement. For example, universal childcare. It's something the Nordic societies have, and it's probably one of the main reasons why they don't have a problem with child poverty to the degree that we do. Our child poverty statistics are very alarming, and things are getting worse. But the Nordic societies, free universal childcare, which is actually very expensive to pay for in the UK for parents and single parents, etc. So that's one thing that we could learn. More generous welfare benefits as well, of course, is what we could learn from them as well, particularly for pensioners and for people who lose their jobs. If you lose your job in a Nordic society, you get a whole year of income that is equal to what you earned during your employment. So it gives you a chance to retrain, to reinvest in finding a new job. It also makes it easier for you to leave a job that you hate, because the state will look after you for a year so that you can retrain and do something that you love. So those things are just not things that we could easily implement in the UK because of our kind of liberal perspective on welfare.
But I think to touch on some of those latter points you're making, this is one of the reasons why I think we need to look so carefully at the long-term impacts of AI when it comes to welfare. So we talk about when a person loses their job, they receive the equal salary so that they can retrain and reskill. Likewise, if not merely your job, but a whole sector has now been automated, there's going to be a whole sector worth of workers who need to reskill and retrain. So there could be whole areas that have suddenly became less attractive, less jobs going. Likewise, as AI is used perhaps in medical settings and ideally would allow humans to live for longer, more of us to live for longer, there'll be an increasingly larger elderly population, which will have further demands on social care and care work. Again, so with the pros of AI perhaps improving our health and lifespan, comes then the cost of, well, this is going to be even more demand on welfare and social services. So it's really got to be worked out very carefully here. We might face a situation where as more jobs are displaced because of automation, that we are going to be forced into needing to find ways to fund huge waves of people to be retrained. And again, taxing the companies that do this might be one way of going about it. That if you're going to replace your workforce and essentially make their skills and their abilities financially less attractive in the marketplace, then you're going to have to be taxed to allow people to retrain into skills that are. How else is it going to be paid for? Or at least that's one option, and that could again be a method of deterring companies from mass displacement and instead opt for augmentation.
Okay, then just on that then, how do you hope that this article that we've all been involved in influences policymakers?
Okay, well, I would just say, I think we present quite an interesting set of ideas for the current Labour government. If they study these ideas, and I think we do offer them an opportunity to, they've got 4 years before the next general election. They're in a really bad state politically at the moment. They're obviously way behind reform. Jeremy Corbyn's new party, it seems to be more popular than the Labour Party, and this government has only been in power for a year. So that's quite remarkable. The collapse of support for Labour just in 12 months is quite remarkable. It's, there's lots of different explanations, one of them being incompetency, the other being the economic policy that they've followed, their unwillingness to change their fiscal rules and that kind of stuff, and the complete insensitivity and incompetence about welfare, particularly winter fuel allowance cuts and all that kind of stuff. So they need a new plan, and a lot of what we say in the article is really good basis for them to start thinking about these different approaches, a more radical approach to welfare that addresses the real issues of, we've still got poor public services, we've got the threat of AI making people redundant, etc. So we do present those arguments, and if they did act on some of those recommendations, I think they could turn around the fact that they're unpopular, because some of those policies would, I think, be more popular than the path that they're on at the moment.
From my side, I'd like to see perhaps a more holistic view of AI. Of course, artificial intelligence, generative AI, it brings a lot of opportunities for growth for companies, and it's certainly something we do want to be at the back of the line of. It's something we should be investing and working in. But at the same time, we need to perhaps realize the mass social change that AI has the potential to impact upon us. Whether it be changes of lifespan, whether it be changes in lifestyle, whether it be whole professions becoming almost redundant, and how that's going to then impact universities and colleges, how that's going to impact people valuing their own skills, their own meaning and purpose in life, that they've just been replaced by some digital machine. How is that going to affect people's self-esteem, self-value, self-worth, their dignity? So I think these sorts of things need to be thought about more about AI rather than just the economics. I think it's going to be the social impacts, the moral impacts, the psychological impacts it's going to have on us. So I'd like to see perhaps a conversation turn towards that more than just opportunities for economic growth.
Okay, that brings us to the end. I think that's been a really interesting discussion about the article that we've all just had published. I think there's a lot more to come. So perhaps I've got one final question then, maybe. What future research or policy work do you think should follow from this article?
Well, I'm not sure what policy work research should follow, but I'm actually kind of involved at the moment in looking at a UBI in Ireland. There's a universal basic income for artists in Ireland. And it's gone on for a few years. It's been extended. It's kind of indefinite. And I'm just looking at what difference does that make to musicians in Ireland compared to musicians in Wales and the UK. And some interesting questions arise about, like, if you get a new UBI as a musician, does it affect the music you create? Does it make you a state musician? What about the authenticity of your work? So I'm kind of in the middle of that kind of project, looking at that. My PhD student and I have another article coming out in Global Social Challenges on UBI in Africa, with a focus of perspectives of politicians in Ghana. So that should be out soon. And then Dave and I were working on UBI and class, aren't we? So, there's another potential article that will emerge there as well.
For me, again, I perhaps sounds like I'm sort of copying here. I'm not too sure about research and policy change. I would want to see more thought being put towards how businesses and companies are to be encouraged to have a healthy adoption of artificial intelligence. To find about ways of doing that. For the public to be more informed about AI, because I think AI is one of these things that is developing so rapidly that as soon as you think you're caught up, the next thing you know, there's something entirely different that's new. So perhaps a way where the general public could be kept abreast at a reasonable speed of development of how quick this is actually developing, how quick, rather than like a 1 year lag behind. And the final feature, this is perhaps going far more towards my philosophy side, but I co-wrote a piece on what we called, Jag and I, the spiritual existential threats posed by AI. And there we were talking about imagining a future where when we're on social media platforms, we can never tell if we're talking to a human or an AI, and whether we think we are being viewed as a human or an AI, and how we're going to be able to adapt into this environment where I can't take for granted that you're a person, and I know that if you are a person, you can't take for granted that I'm a person. So this sort of dehumanized online environment, and how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to adapt to it? And whether hopefully we will rediscover our humanity offline. That's perhaps a positive side to it. So I'm inclined towards that, but I don't see how policy change can move towards that direction. But that's my research interest at the minute with AI.
I think that's a brilliant place to leave it, because that's very deep. Some existential crisis of like the dead internet theory. Okay. I'd like to say a massive thank you very
Absolutely.
much. It's been an absolute pleasure running this
Thank you.
interview, but it's also been a pleasure writing with you, because Heaven and I have written quite a lot together, and long may we continue writing. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you very
Dave.
much.